Rick Hiemstra is the director of the Center for Research on Canadian Evangelicalism, which is part of the overall signature of the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. And he is in a very interesting position doing some fascinating research into evangelicals across the nation and what makes a church tick and what's working, what's not working, what's hot, what's not. Welcome, Rick.
Thank you.
Good to have you here. So what's hot? What are you studying these days?
Well, most recently we've released a paper that looks at the voting intentions of Canadian evangelicals. And maybe I just back up for a second and tell you why it's maybe important that we do this. One of the reasons the Centre got started was to improve the representations of evangelicals in Canada. I was on the Business News Network in December, and I was being interviewed about the downturn in the economy and how that's affecting churches. But as I was being interviewed, they were playing pictures of Mike Huckabee in the background behind me. And that tells me two things: that in our culture, we're seen through an American lens and significantly through a political lens. And so one of the things that we wanted to do with this study of how Canadian evangelicals vote is to put out a more accurate picture of, if we are politically engaged, how are we?
And the assumption with Huckabee in the background would be that if you're an evangelical, you vote Republican.
That's true, but in Canada we don't have a Republican Party.
We don't have a Republican Party, but the point being that you're a right-winger.
Yeah. In fact, if there's any differences between us at all, the biggest differences show up between American and Canadian evangelicals in how we vote.
And how do we vote?
Well, back in 1996, we voted pretty much like the rest of the country, with a very slight bias towards conservative parties. So the Liberal Party was actually the most popular party among evangelicals in every area of the country, including out west. Over time, there's been a shift so that today the number one party for evangelicals is the Conservatives, and the number two is the New Democratic Party. The Liberals have fallen to number three.
And that would reflect, I think, what's happening across the board. I'm sure that non-evangelicals are reflecting a similar trend.
Yeah, there were similar trends. For evangelicals, I think it had to do with the issues of how the parties engaged us or didn't engage us. There were a number of issues through the last decade where the Liberal Party tried either to marginalize evangelicals for short-term political gain or to narrow the scope for political engagement in the public square.
I thought that the attempt of the Liberals to paint Harper years back as operating with a secret agenda really exploded in their face. I mean, the implication was that all evangelicals have a secret agenda.
Well, I think that our agenda is actually a fairly public one, right? The issues that are important for evangelicals today are things like human trafficking, poverty and homelessness issues. And these are the ones that are front and center for us. Again, we've run into an issue with how our culture has been engaged, because it's largely been engaged through that American lens, people looking through the United States back into Canada and projecting that image onto us. When the evangelical church, we're doing what Jesus wants us to do in terms of feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, looking after the widow and the orphan. These are the things that drive the evangelical heart.
Now, a few years ago on my Eye to Eye show, I interviewed, is it Andrew Grenville?
Yes.
Yeah, from Ipsos Reid. And he was telling me at that time of a study that had been done across the country of religious faith. And it was actually a surprise to me to see how many people believe in God, believe that salvation comes through Jesus Christ. In fact, it seems that there's a majority of Canadians who tend in that direction.
Yeah, sociologists have said that Canadians are a country of believers, not belongers. And so it depends on the question that you ask. It's a good question to ask whether people believe in God, but then you have to ask what do they do and how does that play out in their lives. And so while roughly 80% of Canadians will say they believe in God, when you ask them, do they attend church, roughly about 20% will say that they attend a religious service of any kind on a weekly basis.
What percentage of Canadians, or do you even have this available, would call themselves evangelicals?
That again depends on how you're counting, but if we use the measure that Ipsos Reid and others do in their stats, there's probably about 12% of the country that are Protestant evangelicals, or what we call evangelically aligned. And then there's another, about 7% that are Roman Catholic, and we say that they're Catholics that are evangelically aligned, and that means that they believe and behave in a way that's similar to us.
And what would that be? You know, if I'm sure there's a lot of people listening to you right now who aren't too sure what an evangelical is.
Right.
Why don't you tell us what your understanding of evangelical means?
Well, the way the Christian Evangelical scale, which by the way was developed by Andrew Grenville and George Rawlick, who's a late historian, they look at several questions that look at attitudes towards evangelism, church attendance, belief in the death and resurrection of Christ as an atonement for our sin, and a number of other theological questions. So you have a combination of what do you do with your faith and what do you believe. And when they put those together, they score each question, and if you get above a certain threshold, we say that you're evangelically aligned.
And evangelical comes, I think, from a Greek word,
Evangelion.
Evangelion, right?
Yes.
I was thinking Hebrew for a minute. Evangelion, which essentially is just another way of saying good news, right?
Preach the good news.
Preach the good news.
There's a couple of other ways to understand evangelicals. If we go by definition, there's the historical movement that comes out of the revivalist movements in the 1800s. But then added on to that movement, we've seen that there's been groups that maybe didn't consider themselves evangelical in the past, like Mennonites, Christian Reformed churches, that have since identified with the movement and sort of grown its identity and influence.
Are evangelicals fundamentalists?
Fundamentalists are a subset of evangelicals. So in Canada, it's a much smaller group than you would find in the United States. Fundamentalists are sort of set off from evangelicals in terms of their approach to culture, and especially in the reaction to some theologies. But it's usually an approach to how you engage or disengage from culture, and whether you associate with people who you perceive to have wrong theological views. And often fundamentalists will separate themselves from those, even though, like, for instance, like Billy Graham, who they have no problem with his theology or preaching, but because he'll associate with people who maybe are beyond what they would say is proper theology, they'll disassociate themselves from Billy Graham. That's called double separation. And it's that double separation and that approach to culture that separates fundamentalists from evangelicals.
That term fundamentalist can apply to fundamentalist Muslims, fundamentalist Jews, fundamentalist Hindus, fundamentalist Sikhs. I mean, sure. it has a connotation these days of extremism and anti-intellectualism, counterculture. I mean, it's a fairly negative word in our world.
Sure, and it's taken on that role. Years ago, when the term was first used, it merely meant that you were holding on to the fundamentals of the faith. Right. And since then, it's taken on this new meaning in our culture that, yes, it does have an extremist connotation.